Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard. Our panel, our session is based on the topic Rethinking Middle Power and Public Diplomacy, Opportunities and Constraints. Probably we need some, like a few minute intro, how this particular session, the topic came out. First of all, because, we have here in the title, we have two not very familiar notions. The first one is public diplomacy. Evelyn, I know you had some difficulty in grasping the notion of public diplomacy. And also familiar but still controversial notion of middle power. Okay? So we have middle power, we have public diplomacy. The way I see the world today, I believe that there are two contending or interacting trends, or if you like, mega forces that are actually doing a great job in influencing, not simply affecting, but also probably shaping the international politics, world politics today. The first one is, I think, geopolitical power. Many pundits frame the particular phenomenon as the so-called return of geopolitics. When they say return of geopolitics, revival of the 19th century or early 20th century geopolitics, and particularly geopolitics in that particular sense, I probably think of a couple of elements that characterize the classical geopolitics. The first one is nation states as the prime actor and unit in international politics. Another one is great power rivalry, strategic rivalry among nation states, among great powers, particularly for control over space and place. Okay? That, I think, is a second feature. Another one is as a means of accomplishing foreign policy goals, the most dominant means is hard power, military power, and economic power. And as a result, many people think that a viable way to stabilize the international order would be balance of power between and among nation states. But those are features, I think, what we mean by return of geopolitics, which is quite, fierce these days and unfolding in front of our eyes in the 21st century. Another force, I would argue that there is some technological breakthrough, technological innovation, or you could put it like a digital revolution, particularly a series of technological innovations in the field of information communication technology. And some elements actually, sometimes interacting, but many times diluting the conventional geopolitical forces in a couple aspects. The first one, I think, is, the technology is actually a greatly empowering non-state actors, not only individuals, but also NGOs, corporations, and also non-state actors like, unfortunately, the terrorist organization like Islamic State. Okay? And the second element is the rise of new identity politics. Okay? The international actors no longer anchor premised on national identity. We have a lot of different identities, religious identities in the case of Islamic State, some primordial identities, and also some very new identities revolving around some global issues, say climate change, which do not have anything to do with the national identities. It's rather issue-oriented identities, or if you like, it's a global identities. And third one is a series of what I call deterritorialization. Okay, deterritorialization of identity, deterritorialization of space. Okay, we have cyberspace, cyber network throughout the internet, all across the globe. And also we have deterritorialization of the notion of security. Okay? in the form of human security, comprehensive security, last but not least, we also witnessed the rise of sort of like new types of power, which are different not only from hard power, but also from soft power. Okay? Say, what I have in mind is some kind of relational power. Those powers are not for wielding capacity or power over others, but we are producing power together with others. So the notion is quite different from conventional instrumental types of power. So we have, a series of these new elements triggered by technological breakthroughs, I think are interacting with the resuscitating geopolitical forces. And also, against this backdrop, we are witnessing a fairly new realm or field in the international politics, however meager and however small it might be at the moment. And I think that is really a realm for public diplomacy. Okay? So public diplomacy, I need, in the initial beginning stage of this session, I think we need at least to introduce the minimum definition of public diplomacy. Public diplomacy, put it shortly, it's conducting foreign policy by engaging foreign publics. At least the three dimensions, we could at least conceptually we could differentiate traditional diplomacy from public diplomacy. The first one is, object, audience, target of diplomacy. The public diplomacy targeting not at the governments of other countries, but at foreign publics, non-state actors. The second difference is the subject, who will initiate diplomacy. Not only government, but also non-state actors of a particular country could initiate, as a subject of diplomacy, public diplomacy programs or policies. The third difference is means of accomplishing diplomacy. The public diplomacy, they don't rely on hard power, but mostly utilizing soft power as well as other types of non-hard power resources. So, in this, these two, amidst these two contending forces, we clearly see, particularly since the turn of the century, we have witnessed the fierce rise of public diplomacy, not only at the academic dimension, academic realm, but also in the realm of diplomatic practice. And many great powers, including the United States and China, have rushed to the field of public diplomacy for the past 10, 15 years. Well, that is the background how this session and the topic came from. So we have actually today four distinguished panelists. You all know Professor Paul Evans, who is professor and director, Liu Institute for Global Issues, and also Institute of Asian Research, University of British Columbia, Canada. And we have Professor Evelyn Goh. She is a Shedden Professor of Strategic Policy Studies, College of Asia and the Pacific, Australian National University. We have Professor Son Yeol from Graduate School of International Studies at Yonsei University here in Korea. And last but not least, we have Scott Snyder. He's a Senior Fellow for Korean Studies and Director of the Program on U.S.-Korea Policy at Council on Foreign Relations in the United States. But I think this is, I'm not sure this is really intended, but the composition of today's panel is fantastic in the sense that, Paul Evans, he is renowned first-generation theoretician on middle power theory in the international relations field. Evelyn is a rising star in the field of international relations. Particularly, she has been initiating and organizing a multi-year research project, which is titled Strategic Diplomacy. I think it has a very could have an intimate relationship with middle power diplomacy, public diplomacy. Okay, I hope so, I believe so. And Professor Son from Yonsei University, he actually recently published, when I say recently, by the end of last year, he published a book which was co-edited by Jan Mellison. His book title of his book is Understanding Public Diplomacy in East Asia, and subtitled Middle Powers in a Troubled Region. I think he's the right person who could representatively and also authoritatively talk about the topic today based on a book. And Scott Snyder also published last year a book-length policy report, which was published by Council on Foreign Relations, the title of which is South Korea as a Middle Power. Okay. So I believe, I have a perception that Paul and Evelyn probably slightly leaning toward the theoretical side, while Professor Son and Scott, based on the books you wrote recently, could say details about the country cases, examples, and policies. No, I'm not imposing any kind of designated division of labor here, so feel free to say anything. But then, rather than starting with individual initial remark, I think it's better for us to turn directly to question and answers between and among us, and then by the end of the session, we open the panel. How would you say to that, Paul? Is it okay with you? Yeah, all right. I actually would like to ask Paul particularly, based on his professional career, and also he is, from Canada, which is together with Australia, considered as among the first generation middle power countries. So, Paul, would you please give your definition of middle power, and how do you assess the performance as a middle power of the first generation middle power countries, Canada and Evelyn, Australian case, if you like. Would you please, Paul?
Thank you, Dr. Kim. This is wonderful to be part of a panel in the third day of a long conference, and to have a good audience here to join us for the discussion. Now, is that a little better?
Much better. Yeah.
Much better. Usually I'm told my voice is fine, but in this occasion, okay. Lean forward. My sense is that we're talking about two generations of what middle powers mean. And the first generation was began in the 1950s, developed during the Cold War, and related to a group of countries that had several characteristics in common. One was that they had some capacities to influence situations. Second was that they were interested in trying to build rule-based systems. The international system that they wanted to create was one of, as far as possible, of laws, constraints, restraints on all countries in the system. The third part of traditional middle powerism was a special interest in multilateral institutions, rule-based behavior, trying to find ways to mitigate some of the sharp elements of international politics. Middle powers often played mediating roles. Middle powers were interested in things like peacekeeping and setting up operations that tried to, again, take the sharp edges. What they weren't very good at that stage was dealing with superpower confrontation. Middle powers tried to mitigate it around the edges, but it was trying to make the system work a little bit harmoniously and less dangerously. I think now are thinking about middle powers in a second context, a kind of second generation, and it's a more difficult set of problems that they face. When we came yesterday and heard our former heads of government, our prime ministers, former prime ministers speak, their opening comment was exactly what Professor Kim put to us, is that we're in an era where it appears that something like geopolitics and great power rivalries are accelerating, and they're often understood in terms of classic clashes of national interest, plus explained in some other ways. And my suggestion is that the challenge for the middle power in the 21st century, it may be some of the same countries that played those roles in past, but it may be a different group of countries and constellations of people. The challenge for the middle power in the 21st century is different. And that's, how do you maintain a rules-based system? How do you try to moderate conflict and tensions in a context of substantive power shift? In a context where an international order that middle powers and great powers like the United States helped construct, as this system is starting to change because of the rise of other actors, the rise particularly of China, but of other countries in Asia and elsewhere, who are demanding changes in a system. The middle powers role, think of it in that sense, as a set of countries or actors who act across international orders, who have a stake in what exists and wants to see much of it maintained, but also who recognize that compromises and changes and accommodations are necessary to deal with a new set of actors. So that the 21st century issues for middle powers are issues like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. What should we try to do to accommodate Chinese interests and participation in new ways that are as compatible as possible with the systems we know, but that we know we're going to go beyond them? That was exactly the discussion that took place in this room over the last hour and a half. What is new there? It may also be that the challenge for the 21st century middle power is dealing with other kinds of issues like the South China Sea. Where can we try to mitigate conflict, but where, in essence, can we engage rule-based systems that are not black and white, but see evolution and movement? And if I can do some shameless advertising, Dr. Kim, of a publication that is sponsored by the East Asia Foundation. In the most recent edition of Global Asia, we take on the question of what this 21st century security challenge is for middle powers and other countries, how to shape a new regional order. And in it, we make the case that middle powers, among others, have a role to play in this. That a G2 world is not the world that we think will be most stable or that will be most appropriate to build it, that reflects the circumstances of integrated economies in the region. And so what we outline in this is a series of essays, some of which are by people in this room, on what, or at least part of the role that the 21st century middle power has to play. And I'll conclude by saying that that means standing between two big countries that are going in very different directions on some issues. And so that challenge of being able to find a group of like-minded countries that can try to play a constructive role in this is a challenge. I'd be happy to talk about the Canadian case. Canada is back after 10 years when middle power was banned from the vocabulary of our diplomats. Canadians are beginning to think and talk like Canadians again. And in Ottawa now, the discussion, why this panel is interesting and what I'll be taking back to it, isn't because of theory. It's because of a very practical recalculation of where Canada wants to position itself in a shifting balance of power, recognizing a very close relationship with the United States on almost every level, but also a deepening relationship with China, and that hard question of what kind of rules do we want, how are the systems that we have created going to need to be adjusted? That's the middle power dilemma for the 21st century.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. I think he actually opened the horizon of issues that the middle powers in the 21st century are facing. Could I ask a quick question, Paul? Yeah. The first one is definition of middle powers. Mostly middle powers are defined in terms of the size of the country, particularly in terms of hard power. So in terms of hard power, economic and hard power, those countries related somewhere in between great powers and non-great powers. What else?
Okay.
What else do we need to be qualified as middle powers? Some people argue that we need some kind of a positioning, which is quite an abstract term. Some people again say we need some specific functions and roles in international society. So other than hard power capacity, how would you say about the criterion of middle power?
First is attributes, certain capacities, size, an ability to influence some kinds of outcomes. So that's the easy definition. Middle power is somewhere in between. The second is attitude, and it's an attitude towards international order that focuses as far as possible on rule-based behavior, norms, multilateral institutions, the desire to bring a kind of society to international politics. But I think, Professor Kim, that the third dimension now is that it's about an identity. And it's an identity in the international system that believes in rules, believes in institutions, but believes that systems have to be changed and altered. And so that if we put it in the context of China and a middle kingdom, well, the middle power in this 21st century context stands between and across different international orders. And that's an idea that is a wee bit tricky to get a mind around for intellectuals, but also for our policy communities. Canadians are now significantly debating whether we can play a middle power role if it essentially is going to mean supporting some aspects of Chinese positioning on questions, accommodating some Chinese interests. At the same time, we maintain a very close relationship with the United States. So, but it's that attitude that you're in the midst of systemic change, and how do you get as positive an outcome from that as possible?
Okay, good. Thank you. One another question. Some people, for example, the renowned international relations scholar, Japanese scholar Yoshide Sueya, he argues that Japan is a middle power. What's your response to that, based on your definition?
Yeah, I mean, there's been no more interesting character over the last 20 years in debating what middle power means than Sueya Yoshihide. And Yoshi's argument that Japan is a middle power is part aspirational. He says it's what Japan should be and what it can be. Based on limited capabilities, Japan does not have the full set of power instruments that we normally attribute to a great power in the 21st century, including nuclear weapons. It does not have force capabilities. And in that sense, it's not grossly dissimilar to the Australias, the Canadas, there's something else. But what he also argues that as countries go, there haven't been many that have been better than Japan as living in a rule-based order. The Japanese have been strong on disarmament issues. Japanese have been strong in the context of multilateral institutions. But the challenge for Japan is the nature of its relationship with the United States, and a deep, abiding alliance that have put constraints on independent Japanese action at least in some areas. And so his aspiration for Japan to be a middle power runs directly into the strength of the alliances. This volume, the most important essays in it, are talking about the tension between multilateral systems and alliance systems. And so Professor Sueya aspires for Japan as a middle power, but at the same time he realizes it's something it can't achieve, at least in the short term.
Okay.
Korea can do it better.
All right, thank you. Okay, since he nicely opened the initial part of the session, for three distinguished panelists, I would like to pose a common same question. The question will be, the two mega forces interplaying with each other that I introduced in the first, the initial in the beginning, I mean, does this interplay between two forces? Does this mean we are moving away from great power-centered world politics towards some pluralization or democratization, or if you like, power diffusion of world politics? How would you see the outcome or the process of those two forces interacting with each other? Evelyn? Yeah.
I think it means that we stop asking questions whether or, either or, this or that. I think it means that we're moving towards a world which is both plural, or let me rephrase, which is both dominated by power politics and dominated by growing interdependence, and therefore the need for cooperation. I think too often we ask the wrong questions, so we get the wrong answers. We try sometimes to say, well, if it is true that we now live in a globalized world that is more heavily interdependent than before, then we ought to have less conflict and less war because we are more interdependent, so we should cooperate more. That is a fallacy because, as we have seen, the world has been globalizing very seriously for the last 50 years or so, since the 1970s, with improvements in technology, with communications, space between people, between countries, between territories has reduced. The time it takes to communicate has massively reduced. We've become despatialized, deterritorialized, as you say, in many ways. But deterritorialization leads both to increased conflict and the need for increased cooperation, both. Right? You would find your noisy neighbor a lot less annoying if you couldn't, if their fence were not, 1 meter next to you, right? But because we are now deterritorialized and the space between us is much closer, you hear your noisy neighbor more. Therefore, he annoys you more, right? So we have a world that is both increasingly conflictual and increasingly needs to be cooperative. This makes both power politics more intense, but cooperative enterprises more important. So, unfortunately, we live in a world in which we have to excel both at either fighting or mitigating wars and at cooperating across boundaries, across issue areas, and across nations. So I don't think it's an either-or situation. The challenge is even worse, is that we actually have to be good at both.
Okay. So could I ask another follow-up question? If those are coexisting together, the type of coexistence of two mega forces interplaying together, what is the implications for middle power countries? Not great power, not lesser powers, but middle powers as defined by Paul. What those two? What does that mean? Yeah, Evelyn.
I think the first thing to understand, we've heard Paul, and I think you're right, Paul, there was that first generation of middle powers, and now we're at a stage where we're starting to think about middle powers a bit differently, and the categories are bigger. Now, one really important point of intersection is that we've got to understand that the first generation of middle powers belong to a very particular historical context. It was after the Cold War. Basically, the Americans had won. The other side had lost. And if you think about all the first generation middle powers, they were all American allies, right? And yes, they wanted to have a rules-based order about whose rules, right? It's very clear whose rules. And it's very clear what the middle powers of that generation were there to do. They were there to preserve the US-led world order for as long as possible. Right. And at that time, the idea was that China and other powers would be integrated into this order really without much change to the nature of the rules. Right? So the challenge for that generation of middle powers no longer is the same one at all. And so when that's when geopolitics and the interdependence and cooperative imperative actually coincided quite nicely, because there was not a need to trade it off. Now, for this generation of middle powers, you actually have to think about the trade-off. How are you going to trade between your interdependence with China and your dependence on the Chinese economy? How are you going to trade that off against your security reliance on the United States? Right, directly or indirectly. All of East Asia directly or indirectly depends.
That's a very interesting point.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
Could you please give me a specific example? For example, how possibly, Australia could behave toward China in a particular context of compromise?
yes, that's an interesting one. That's one that's been puzzling me as well. I have no answer. I think that Australia, and I won't speak for the Australian government because I have no special information about the Australian government, but it seems to me as a scholar that the hope in Australia, like in many other Asian countries, is that it can continue to benefit from China's growth, economic growth, and to benefit from access to the Chinese market, while playing its role and doing its duty and going above its duty sometimes as an American ally in upholding regional order. There is an aspiration that there is no need for a trade-off. I think we're probably coming closer now to a point in time when there may be a forced trade-off in terms of how China would react. For example, if the Australians would decide that they would strenuously conduct what are called FONOPs, right? Freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, for example, in a very strenuous way alongside the United States. For example, right? And in that kind of situation, if pressure is applied.
Isn't it sort of like a very painful dilemma situation? I'm saying this because South Korea, I believe, is in a sense quite a similar situation. Why? Because somewhere in between, in between China and the United States, if we look at the security dimension, we have no other option but to be very reliant in the United States because of very provocative North Korea. But also at the same time, we look at the economic side. Korea is one of the most relying on international trade. The entire volume of bilateral trade with China takes up almost like 25%, almost 30% of the Korea total international trade. So in that sense, we are quite dependent economically on China. So in that sense, between security and economy, we are somewhere in between China and the United States. But this is by no sense a voluntary option.
Absolutely.
The choice that we voluntarily make. It could be a dilemma.
Yeah, but Korea does much better in managing that situation than other countries. Well, partly because Korea has good diplomacy and good strategic diplomacy, but mainly, I think, because you have North Korea. And the alliance is there because mainly, or you can present the alliance as being there mainly because of the threat from North Korea. And North Korea is not China. Whereas for Japan, for example, currently, the alliance with the United States is presented as being mainly China against China. Right? For Australia, it's a kind of a strange situation. I personally don't really understand, how the Australians play this, even though I am located in Australia. But if we simply compare Japan and Korea, because you have the North Korean threat, which is a very real threat, and that is what you rely on the United States security umbrella for primarily. It's not necessarily perceived as primarily threatening by China necessarily. So that's one major difference.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Thank you. And Scott, I'm going to ask the same question. The interplay of two forces, does that mean we are moving away from great power-centered world toward more plural world? And if that is the case, if that is not the case, anyhow, what is the implication for middle powers of the current world politics?
Well, I basically agree with Evelyn on the nature of contemporary global politics, which is a system of complexity. It's a complex system where you see traditional type of power politics, I mean, geopolitics there, but at the same time, there's a increasing the area of new type of politics, which I use the term network politics, where you have more actors interact with each other, networked, interdependent. Then your power is not solely based on what your military power, economic power, but knowledge is very much important. Your soft power is important. Your ability to networking with other actors. You gather people together under your banner, or your position in a certain position that two other parties can connect through yourself, so that you generate your power, etc. So. We see the traditional, area of international politics, but also emerging fields of emerging areas of international politics that is qualitatively different. But I'm not saying that the world is moving from A to B. Maybe we are somewhere in between, but at the moment or in the near future, I don't think that geopolitics will recede, and we will see the new type of power emerging. So it's a very much complex system, and also the complexity comes from, it seems like you have two layers: traditional geopolitics and interdependent network politics. But two are interrelated, obviously. So what Evelyn just mentioned. For example, the previous session, we know that there are, in the field of economics, it seems like United States and China are competing with each other. But at the same time, there are a lot of areas in which you can cooperate, and actually they are cooperating because of the tight interdependence between them and interdependence with other actors. But if those relations are increasingly securitized by whatever reasons, security reasons, then we see these two layers are laterally interrelated and then affects with each other. So you can't really say that the world is A or B, but it's interrelated. Now, the role of middle powers, I should define it. I'm not going to give sort of analytical definition to middle power. Middle power is this, so that we analyzed. I explained the word through this kind of concept, but the concept itself has changed, as Paul just mentioned. And I take the sort of constructivist position that the system changes, then you define, and you redefine the role of the middle powers. In that sense, Korea as a middle power here in a contemporary global context. It's as a middle power in terms of your resource power, right? The economic and military power, hard to play actively in the field of traditional politics, traditional geopolitics. Particularly in this part of the world, you have two superpowers and four major powers, and you're squeezed within. So you can't really play balancer or whatever as a middle power in this terrain. But in other areas like trade, many economic areas or non-traditional areas where you see more actors are engaged and interact with each other through the networks, then you can have a larger space to play an active role within the institutions, or outside the institutions. You can leverage multiple institutions. I also want to use the example of previous session where you have multilateral frameworks or institutions in development. in trade, right? Then you need a sort of institutional architecture here. Then South Korea can play a role where you really need knowledge and experiences of the countries that are not really a great power status. So I think that the middle powers role can be played better in those networked issue areas than traditional areas defined by the anarchy.
Okay, good. Please, could you talked about the network politics or network area. I think it's a fascinating notion. How about South Korea? Can you give me some specific examples in which South Korea is actually utilizing the new realm of network politics? Is there any exemplar cases?
I categorize three roles. One is the role of convening actors.
Convening?
Convening means that you're collecting. You're making links to multiple actors. This is typically. Singapore, Chile. They are doing very well in the field of trade, in other areas. So that's one area that South Korea also you've been doing very well in the field of trade. Little more tricky but promising is using your so-called positional advantage in the network, where you have two separate networks, maybe competing or located, and then you are in between, so you can connect those two networks. Otherwise, they are not, connected or seems incompatible. But you can connect them together. Hypothetically, trade that I'm very much familiar with. You can do that. Located in between sort of, Asia Pacific networks of trade and Asia network of trade. And obviously Korea is in between. And then you have a lot of, individual bilateral links with those countries, so that you can make a brokerage role or bridging role, so that you can harmonize the identity of the trade institutions or trade networks, so that they can coexist and eventually, evolve into one single network in the future. So that's another one. And a little more ambitious is kind of designing or co-designing the whole network. But typically those tasks are given to the great powers rather than the middle powers. But if you have multiple institutions coexist or competing, contesting, then there is clearly a room for co-designing the whole institutional architecture. So that's the three areas.
Good, thank you. Scott.
Okay, well, this has been such a fascinating discussion so far. The way that I'm thinking about, this challenge, listening to my other panelists, is that it's as though we have moved from the grand chessboard or risk to some kind of three-dimensional chess, or some kind of multiplayer role-playing internet game that started to become popular after I already outgrew it. And so I'm not sure I know very well, how to play. But what that means for Korea, I think, is that, in the grand chessboard, basically Korea was an observer. It was on the side. It was cheering for one team, but it was an observer. Now, in the middle power discourse, Korea is an actor. And I think that in multiplayer role games, how well you act depends on your capability to kind of put ideas together and go for specific niche targets, that kind of thing. So the middle power role, I think, for Korea, it's a complicated one because, there probably are players out there that have more virtual money or, other assets. And so there are constraints, but there are also opportunities. And, this is a multidimensional chess game in which there are more different kinds of moves you can make. I think about Star Trek when I think about the multidimensional chess game. They never told me what the rules were for whatever they were doing when they had the image of multidimensional chess on Star Trek. And so likewise, I'm not sure that we know all the rules, especially if you throw in this concept of power transition, a second-generation challenge for middle powers. And that's very interesting to me because really, most of what I've looked at with regards to Korea in a middle power context so far has been very much looking at the fact that most of Korea's middle power capital that it can spend in order to take actions in the international community actually have been very much supported by its alliance relationship with the United States. Not so different from the way that some of the first generation discussion has actually evolved. And I think that's actually what Korea originally benchmarked 5 or 6 years ago, when they basically started to look seriously at Canada and Australia as potential middle power models. And so this issue of, being a middle power in the context of transition is very interesting, complicated. It probably does mean working together with other middle powers. It probably does mean using new instruments like technologies as a force magnifier or as a path diversifier. And it also means that South Korea has a vested interest in countering the rise of geopolitical competition as a way of trying to preserve space for maneuver as part of its diplomacy. And I think that actually might be one of the most important features as it evolves of Korean foreign policy objectives as they think about navigating in this very complex world. And I'll just add one other thing, because you mentioned identity, and that is, from my point of view, for Korea, the middle power concept has been a very important way of trying to shift Korean identity from one in which national objectives were defined primarily by negative goals, anti-communism, anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, to a positive conception of what South Korea can do in the world. And that's really not, I think, necessarily as connected to some of the other middle power discussion in the literature, but I think it turns out to have been a very important aspect of the middle power discussion as it has evolved within South Korea.
Okay, good. You are quite positive about the South Korea's middle power potential. How would you assess the Korea's attempt at forging a new middle power group called the MIGTA?
Okay.
Yeah,
well, let me just
of
say that
Mexico,
Indonesia. I'm not necessarily incredibly positive because I see the world as framed by constraint. I mean, the middle power concept is very ambiguous in that if you're middle, it means you're not able to shape your own destiny necessarily as you would if you were a great power, but it also means you have some capacity to do something. And then the question is, how do you do what you do? And I mean, MIGTA, it's a new concept yet to be proven. For me, the most interesting aspect of it is it's actually not geographically bounded. And
That's
I
the point.
think that, and I think that but it's also kind of still untested.
Right.
Right. But in a way, it's the centerpiece for thinking about how Korea can escape its geography. Because, I mean, the other paradox for Korea in the middle power context is that, it's much easier to project middle power out of the region at the global level than it is necessarily to, it's not clear to me necessarily what tangibly being a middle power means for South Korea as long as it's surrounded by larger powers.
Okay, great. Paul, I think you have some responses, comments to other panelists.
I do.
Yeah.
But I want, Chair, to go back to the question you pushed at the beginning, by revisiting the middle power concept, but also revisiting public diplomacy
Right,
at
yeah.
the same time.
Good, yeah.
I mean, you're putting two kinds of ideas that have got us thinking in about a multi-centric world order, about multi-level games, three-level games, et cetera. And let me try and think through that one of where middle power now connects to public diplomacy. And public diplomacy, I mean, as we've been discussing it, I'm hearing two different things. Public diplomacy is about the way that governments try to affect publics in other countries. Broadcasting messages, use of soft power instruments, but that's one conception. Public diplomacy is how governments try to shape public thinking. The other way that we've been talking about it is how publics try to shape government thinking. And
Precisely.
let me give an example of that, of classic middle power use of public diplomacy, where actually the two ran together. When Canada and a number of other countries wanted to advance a human security agenda in the 1990s and early 2000s on issues including the anti-personnel landmines, the International Criminal Court, the responsibility to protect, what the Canadian government did in that creative moment was, we're not going to be able to do this as a country on our own, even with other countries that want to work with us. We have to bring more people on side. And how we're going to do that is by going directly to their public, not through the Canadian government, but through Canadian-based NGOs. And the coalition that emerged in the anti-personnel landmine campaign, the person who won the Nobel Peace Prize for that was not the Canadian foreign minister, but it was the person who was leading the NGO campaign. And so there was this kind of what was called the coalition of the willing, not as George Bush used the concept of coalition of the willing, but government actors working with civil society players and using their networks to try to move something forward. And the middle powers, Australia did this with some nuclear issues. They did it with the Cairns Group on trade policy. Again, where you'd have this combination of states and civil society working together. That has become more difficult. It's become more difficult, we found in the Canadian case, because the Bush administration that did not like where Canada was going with some of this found ways to work with American NGOs for purposes of blocking some of these initiatives, or alternatively, trying to make sure that the arena where these issues were played out was a strictly governmental one, that is to say, in the United Nations. Almost all of the major middle power initiatives, with the exception of the responsibility to protect, did not go through the United Nations. They went through other kinds of treaties and processes that could not be controlled by governments themselves. So that's in the old story, I mean, or at least a story of 15 years ago. The story is right now, what does it mean? What does it mean if you want to try and play a constructive role in the context of the growing crisis in the South China Sea? ASEAN is trying to do it through a variety of mechanisms, and they are middle power-like in certain respects. We think it means it's going to be working on non-traditional security issues like fish stocks in the region, environmental damage in the region, where there's the possibility of countries that would like to see new forms of collaboration working with NGOs and others that have the environmental concern up front. Now that's kind of mobilization with 21st century characteristics, where generally governments don't play this game as well as NGOs and civil society do. The balance of forces. Governments can stop certain things from happening. They can censor and control, but very few governments are as sophisticated as civil society in getting their messages out. So that's one of the new battlefields in middle power meets public diplomacy.
Great. Yeah, I cannot agree more with Paul's point, because when we talk about the public diplomacy, obviously the object target of diplomacy is not government, but the non-state actors. But in the 21st century, what is totally new is the rise of, as I said, deterritorialization of space, okay, cyberspace and network, and international social movement, international non-governmental organizations. So one of the directions, mid-power public diplomacy in the 21st century, probably would pay attention to the rising new space, new non-state actors. Right? So as a target, as an object of mid-power public diplomacy. That said, my next question is we talked about as specific issues like human rights, banning landmines, and also climate change. What would you see the niche issues the middle powers in the realm of public diplomacy should tackle in this century? What kind of issues are we talking about? Like human rights still? I mean, wartime atrocity or climate change? What specific issues? I mean, probably it could vary depending on different middle power countries. Say, for example, Singapore, Australia, Canada, Korea. Are there any some particular specific issue areas? Evelyn? Yeah.
You know, part of the implication of recognizing that kind of complex world we live in, I think, is that it's increasingly less easy to say that something is niche. Because what seems to be niche to us traditional security types actually turns out to be pretty crucial in real life. For example, Paul brought up fisheries. I think it's fair to say that in the South China Sea, fisheries is not a niche issue. Right? Fisheries very often is the issue. Fisheries are even more important than bits of reclaimed land. You know, if there's going to be a fight in the South China Sea, it's going to start over fish. So, you know, I'm going to say that fisheries is one of these things, but it's not a niche issue. It's actually vitally important. And, you know, again, you know, the fight over fish in the South China Sea, also in the East China Sea, actually in all the seas of the world, is because of that clash of, you know, growing interdependence, growing populations, growing demand for fish, fishermen whose traditional fishing grounds, you know, could be previously quite relatively peacefully divided, even though they were from different countries, now cannot be because the demand for fish is so high and the stocks are dwindling so quickly. So, you know, that's not a niche issue. That one's very important. The other area, and this one, Professor Sun, I think is better equipped to talk about than I am, but financial issues. Issues of financial governance, deregulation, regulation, etc. This is a huge, complex area, both in Asia and in the international realm. And it seems to me that that's one very key area in which, you know, I prefer to call them non-great power states, like Korea especially, which is so plugged into international production networks, but also international financial networks, and so well represented in these networks, has enormous potential to play much more of an influence in the years to come. Again, but financial regulation and deregulation is not at all niche in the real world. It is quite crucial. Yeah. So I mean, for me, those are two examples.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. It's no longer niche. It's a crucial central issue. Okay, Yor, would you please on issues?
Yeah, I already mentioned, you know, there are traditional security areas and the non-traditional and economic issue areas, and I think, you know, middle powers can, you know, find the larger place, I mean, larger space in activate their middle power role in the latter cases. So if you ask me, you know, all those areas are filled for middle power diplomacy. But let me tell you this. Even though South Korea, in terms of their size, became a middle power or middle power status, you know, practitioners and also the scholars don't use it, the term. I mean, back in 2000s, for example, there are lots of diplomatic initiatives that we can call it middle power diplomacy or middle power's role, but you never use it. Partly because the middle power diplomacy or middle power role has been defined by Canada and Australia. I mean, their foreign policies. But their foreign policies are, ontologically different. South Korea is faced with grave security threats. So your foreign policy, always tackle the most important issues. And of course, all other issues to be tackled as well. So the middle power role, I believe, should tackle the real security issues. Real dilemmas that we are facing. Mm-hmm. And then that phase means that, we just, mentioned that you are between two great powers, and not just two great powers, but two other greater, big powers, militarily and economically. In that sense, the middle power role should incorporate this realm of diplomacy. Otherwise, it's a marginal thing. Otherwise, this is just what the current government says, that, middle power diplomacy is only applied to global governance, some areas of global governance. Then it takes a marginal place in the Korean national, Korean foreign policy. So I'm not advocating, find niches and things like that, but I advocate that, we use new definition of middle power and then apply that to solve the real important real important issues here in the Korean Peninsula. And the idea always comes from what Paul said, that the in-betweenness, right? Mm-hmm. You are in between. Mm-hmm. So you try to formulate foreign policies as a middle power in resolving those issues. I know that's a daunting task, but
yeah, but it seems to be that you're saying there are two uncrossable, two separate volumes. One is hardcore security, in which the great powers like the United States, China, particularly for South Korea, they prevail. Great powers or major powers, they prevail. And another realm, which is separated from the one, that is the realm of public diplomacy, realm of middle power diplomacy. So these two are totally two different separate worlds. Is that what you mean?
I'm not.
And you're saying that when middle power diplomacy is trying to get across the borders, then it could be marginalized. That's what you said. So
what I'm saying is that the world is. You have two layers, mm-hmm. and then those two are. Maybe you can see this as a polar extreme, but most of the diplomatic, most of the areas of international politics are lying in between and on the continuum of traditional hard, great power politics to the postmodern governance. And then issues are, in between, and they are the mix, complex of different sorts of items. So conceptually, we can say that you play as a middle power in dealing with many issues in the continuum where you're starting from the other poles, mm-hmm. The governance to the security areas. And then what I'm saying is that you make efforts to increasingly tackle the little more securitized the issue areas, and then playing a middle power role by building Korea, image of identity of Korea as a middle power in the three areas that I just mentioned.
Okay.
So that's basically.
Scott?
Yeah.
You have some comments on issues?
Yeah, what I see with regards to kind of national branding relating to middle power issues is that you have to have three elements. One, you have to identify what is your comparative advantage, right? What are the things that you are known for in the world as being a leader in? A second is national prioritization. The government has to decide and have the political will to push that issue. For South Korea, the way that comparative advantage and national branding came together a few years ago was through hosting diplomacy in a few specific areas where it hosted the G20, it hosted the OECD DAC meeting, Nuclear Security Summit, and now the Green Climate Fund. Those were all areas where, basically the government led and had the opportunity to shape the agenda as the host of the meeting. They owned that. But then the third issue is sustainability. And that's where I think, honestly, in each of those four areas, South Korea's performance has not lived up to its full capabilities. And what I mean by that is that in each of these four areas, I would argue that expertise has been diffused, that there hasn't been a sustained political commitment or an organizational capacity to help South Korea continue to own those particular issue areas.
Great.
So that's one of the things that I think is kind of missing for now in terms of the step forward in terms of South Korea as a middle power owning a specific issue.
How about Jejuforum? It has sustained for almost like 20 years,
And
demonstrating its convening power, or setting agenda setting power. What would you say to that?
the lineup this year suggests that there's a space.
Okay.
I would say that there has been a space, and that is a good example of sustained commitment. I mean, peace is somewhat amorphous, and so I think the challenge is really trying to drive that into practical action. But I think that the sessions here also have tried very hard to link concept with action, and
Right.
you've got four distinct themes. So
That's
good.
the point. Great. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Since we already have run a couple of rounds between among panelists, I think it's now high time to open the floor. So many. Why don't we have here? Yeah. Please briefly identify yourself when you make a comment or question.
I'm a professor at Ewha Women's University and a research
Oh,
fellow
Leif.
at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. A question for Professor Evans, whose conceptualization of middle powers is extremely useful. In fact, of course, I often cite
Would
you
you
in my own,
please speak up a little bit?
often cite you in my own work. And
keep talking.
yes, and I've already read the great Global Asia issue that you held up, so thank you for that. I do have some questions on a couple of your empirical points, though. First was in response to the question about Japan as a middle power. I think you said that Japan is not a middle power because of its alliance with the United States. But I would argue that Japan is not a middle power because being the number 3 GDP qualifies you as a major power, and Japan's alliance with the United States is actually making Japan an increasingly global actor. So I would appreciate your response. And then second, on Canada, and here I'm at a great disadvantage, but on Canada, I'm not sure about the Canadian position, despite all the important roles that Canada has for building bridges between states internationally. I'm not sure about the Canadian role bridging U.S.-China disagreements, simply because Canada's interests are so close to those of the United States. Instead, I would suggest that instead of trying to find institutional accommodations between the U.S. and China or finding ways of accommodating China's interests, I would see Canada's role to be much more on the public diplomacy side, reaching out to the Chinese population and engaging them on issues of international rules and norms. Thank you.
Paul, please.
Are these add-ons or?
Why don't you get a couple more questions? What? Yeah. Okay. And Professor Moon.
But I really want to be very provocative and challenging. The middle power doesn't make sense at all. It doesn't have any analytical meaning. It's a so porous concept. Okay, it doesn't have any parsimony. In order for middle power to be analytical concept, it got to be very parsimonious. With one or two variables, you got to explain a lot. But you have a geographical middle, hierarchical middle, ideational middle, or in fact, the translation of middle power is a 중견국가. 중견국가 means what? Not just middle power. It's a mature and experienced state. Therefore, if you translate middle power in Korean, there are at least 6 or 7 different ways of defining it. Therefore, unless really we come up with kind of inventory checking of analytical meaning of middle power and really nail them down and find out through the unifying analytical concept, middle power wouldn't have any meaning at all. And second, I think Scott really raised a very important one. You have a declaratory middle power and recognized middle power. That really goes back to Paul's whole this identity issue. Okay? We Koreans declare we are middle power. Nobody recognizes Korea as a middle power. Korea is divided. We talk about Mitka. Okay? Kim Sung-hwan and then Yoon Byung-se have been promoting it. Well, we are using Mitka to what? In order to denunciate North Korea. Okay? It's very instrumental. Not, as Paul pointed out, there got to be some kinds of public diplomacy in elements, such as the promotion of public goods. What our Korean diplomacy doesn't have that one. We are doing a convention diplomacy in order to what? In order to generate the so-called economic side effects of convention industry. That is the way our government pronounces it. Okay? And you got nothing out of G20 meeting, nuclear summit meeting, no follow-up. And as with regard to analytical concept, I will raise this issue to Paul and Evelyn and Sonyal. And as to is really Korea middle power? I will raise that question to Scott Schneider. I know you can get a research grant from the Korean government, but I really don't think that. If I'm an advisor to our foreign ministry, I have been arguing with them. Don't really use the middle power. It's a nonsensical. Others should use it as a middle power. Maybe some people, scholars and public may recognize Canada as a middle power, Norway as a middle power, Denmark as a middle power, but nobody recognizes South Korea as a middle power in that sense. Okay? Other than our GDP size is a number 11 or 12 in the world and all these kinds of things. Sorry, it's a too long comment.
Okay, that is the reason why in the beginning we just said that middle power is very, very controversial notion. Yeah. Chari, please.
Yeah, Professor Moon, I really agree with you after a long while. But yes, yeah, as he made a kind of very good analytical criticism, I wanted to add up. I'm not criticizing personally, but as he mentioned the kind of analytical side of it, I wanted to raise a kind of a practical criticism about the notion of middle power. One of it I wrote at the Joseonilbo about 2 weeks ago about trap of thinking Korea as a middle power. I think the danger of conception of middle power is two, practically. One, you can educate to the public, general public out there that Korea is standing in the middle between without taking any positions and principles and taking initiative. You're standing in the middle, right? So it's a kind of hedging is okay, but overhedging. It's a kind of 왔다리 갔다리 kind of thing. That's a kind of a very, the kind of dangerous notion. And the other thing is a kind of complacency, kind of thinking yourself remaining complacently in the middle capacity country without having any aspiration for further. So kind of, middle country is okay. So we can't go further, so why don't you kind of remain as satisfied about being as a middle power? That's a kind of big danger because that makes you obscurely position yourself without the sense of responsibility and principles and the leadership. So we can send a kind of wrong message to the general public and to the world that Korea is just a middle power. Middle power sounds very good, but it's a kind of, if I look at the other way around, just the middle, Korea is just the middle power. Don't evaluate more. So that's the reason why I said in the Washington conference, Korea should be recognized as a pivotal power rather than a middle power. So, Scott, if you have any comments to that, what is the Korea's role to play, going beyond the middle power? I want to hear.
All right. Do you have more comments or questions from the floor? Okay, the gentleman in the back. Could you please
My
be
name
very
is
quick? Yeah.
Huang Jing or Jing Huang from National University of Singapore. Hello.
Uh-huh.
And I think middle power has always been a controversial issue.
Right.
Because first, by definition, how do you define a middle power? Is by the size, by GDP, by its power capability, or by the role it plays. For example, if you define by size, South Korea is a middle power. But if defined by the role it plays, like say North Korea, it's a major power. Israel, another example, it's a small power. But if you talk about Middle East, Israel is a major power. So that's the first issue. Second is that in the established international system, how do we define middle power? Again, it's a problem, like United Nations, global financial order, and anti-terrorist struggles, you name it. In all those major global issues, environmental issues, how do you define middle power's play? Again, there is a problem. For example, if you have major power China is a developing country. On the environmental issues, anti-terrorism issues, China may not play that big role because China does not want to take that much responsibilities. But some developed countries like Germany, France, is a middle power, but they play a major role. So I think that middle power is problematic in terms of definition, the role it plays, and the event that involve this power. In other words, I agree with the two previous colleagues. I think middle power has to be, like you said, really we should rethink about middle power, the definition, the role it can play, and the strategic position it takes in a given issue we call the global issue. That's my comment.
Thank you very much. Now we almost run out of time. I have no choice but to give you only 1 minute per panelist. But Paul, 2 minutes, particularly for you, because Leif raised the question to you.
Oh, no. I think
okay.
the discussion is really just beginning. And this, let me just say two things to conclude, and we can continue some of these things. This word middle is causing a lot of problems in this discussion. And you put it, I thought, most strongly when you said, to be in the middle, you're a nothing. You're there, you're in between. Well, that's exactly the point. We are in between great powers. All of us are at this time. And what we're going to try to do to define the terms of those interactions in ways that are good for us and for the world is what the middle power agenda is about. Second is how difficult it has been for middle powers to collaborate in this 21st century context. We have run series of meetings with Australians, South Koreans, Norwegians about what the agenda is. We can agree on specific issues, but in terms of working as a unified force, it's been very difficult. Perhaps the closest we came was when we tried to push the concept of the G20 and created that. We've got a number of countries that were thinking in the same direction at the same time. In Canada, we banned the term middle power for a decade. The Conservative government would not go for it because it stood for many of the things you thought, standing in the middle, not wanting to advance your own interests. The new Canadian government is trying to reinvent what middle power means, or call it by another name. Some say that middle power is so confusing that it would be better to call it a constructive power, or a pivotal power, or a brokerage power. They're trying to play a game. But we're trying, particularly vis-a-vis China, to go back to the question that was raised, and I'll finish with this. We are sticking with the term middle power, in part because the Chinese like it so much. And I'll end with a very short story. We've just gone through the archives in China between 1968 and 1970, when Canada was negotiating diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. And the question, we thought it was all about, we didn't know what the Chinese were thinking. We now know what at least was in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs archives. Why did China want to negotiate with Canada in 1968 to 70, when Zhou Enlai is hanging by a thread in the context of the Cultural Revolution? Why did they want to move with Canada then? There were three reasons the Chinese gave then. First was that Canada is close to the United States. Second, that Canada was somewhat different than the United States. But the third, Zhou Enlai was able to convince the other members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, was that Canada had an approach to global affairs that was different than the Americans, at least in some respects, and that Canada wanted to end a Cold War rather than continue it indefinitely before the Americans got to that point. So I put it, as we go now and as we're renegotiating our relationships with the People's Republic of China, the middle power is one that deeply appeals to them in the way that they understand that there are going to need to be buffer countries that can help with a transition, not always on their terms, but that are going to be essentially helping to make that transition in the relationship with the United States stable. So this is the beginning of the discussion, and as a Canadian, we can again talk about it. So welcome us back for the next round of discussion.
Evelyn?
I guess I have 2 points to make to conclude very quickly. I agree. I have problems with the middle power category because it has no analytical traction. And I've heard more about middle power in the last 3 years than I really want to since I moved to Australia. But having said that, I think we got slightly sidetracked because I think the interesting part of the theme of this panel, to some extent, was about the potential for public diplomacy that Korea in particular might be able to deploy. And on that one, I'd just like to add, that unlike Scott, I think that Korea has a particular advantage in Asia. And that there is probably no need for Korea to try and do the old middle power thing of trying to escape its region. I think that Korea has Asia as its comparative advantage. Korea now has a reputation and a credibility on a variety of fronts in Asia that it has never enjoyed before, and arguably that no other East Asian country has ever enjoyed before. Now, if you want to think about public diplomacy, I suggest to you that you think about how you would reach your enormous Chinese audience that you already have. Think about the success of, your K-dramas. The Chinese cabinet was held captive by, what was it? My Love from the Stars? I don't know what the Korean, and recently Descendants of the Sun was your most successful promotional campaign for the Korean armed forces ever. Try and make one about peaceful resolution of the South China Sea disputes, for example, would take you quite far.
And
I don't think that this is a place to discuss the concept of middle power. I just conceive it as mid-sized power, which is not great power nor weak nations, somewhere in between. You can't give totalizing definition to the bunch of countries in between. So in that sense, if you do it approach in that way, it's a residual concept. But for Korea or individual countries, you define your role, your position in the hierarchy of international system in a particular way. And I think that the middle power is an expression of relocating your position, your status in the system, and then recalibrating your role. So middle power, the concept itself cannot contain all those things, but it's just one word that depict this kind of direction of your understanding, or maybe I can put the aspiration of South Korea in using that term to realize certain goals. So I just approached it in that way. And in order to do so, the first thing is quite clear. You relied on alliance with the United States in almost every sphere of your diplomacy. If you exaggerate, then moving beyond, or beyond means that alliance plus. something else, then you need a new way of thinking. In that sense, that requires sort of, domestic reorganizations and international recognitions that Professor Moon just said. That international recognition is one, and also domestic ratification another. So you have, two-way battle when you push these things. And in that sense, public diplomacy is very much important to identify yourself and then persuade the people that we are pursuing is something our size that something that commensurate with the expanded size of South Korea in the global world. So we got to do this and that, and then persuade domestic audiences, not giving conflict signals that at one point you are seeking development country status in gaining in the climate change, or in other areas you're thriving for middle power status and things like that. So in that sense, you mentioned the sustainability or consistency in sending signals in order to persuade both audiences in the world. I think it's very much important.
Okay, Scott, you have a final 1 minute.
Okay, I'll also make 2 points. One is that the only argument among Koreans that I've seen that was bigger than this one was when I put on the agenda a discussion about Korea as a quote-unquote self-described middle power. And then the Koreans all fought about why self-described. But, the really interesting thing for me about the middle power discussion is actually the underlying question that we really could not talk about 15 years ago in South Korea, and that is, how does a less powerful actor, alone or in concert, influence larger actors to act constructively or positively for South Korean interests? That's actually a relatively new question for South Korean diplomacy, and I think it's the critical question going forward.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's a wonderful session, although we have more questions open to answer. But then for the wonderful contribution, please join me thanking their great job. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.